Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and all those in the audience and watching around the world who love freedom and democracy, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm honored to be with you and on the same panel with so many outstanding public servants. A few weeks ago, President Obama announced that all U.S. troops would be withdrawn from Iraq by the end of this December. The reasons the President gave for his decision need not concern us today. But what does concern us today are the implications for the safety and security of the residents of Camp Ashraf. Because whatever dwindling influence the U.S. government still retains in Iraq, it will evaporate completely once American forces exit that country. Iraqi officials have been quoted as saying that they will close the camp by the end of this year and relocate the residents elsewhere within Iraq. No one should be under any illusion as to what this would mean for the residents. In his memoirs, former President Bill Clinton recounts in painful detail his deep remorse at standing by and doing nothing. President Clinton's wife is now the Secretary of State and has the power to remedy the injustice at Camp Ashraf. No one is asking Secretary of State Clinton to send troops or to enlist the help of our European allies this time. All she has to do is delist the MEK. Time is short and the need for action is urgent. But there are some hopeful signs to sustain us in this fight. There are some recent developments that are starting to favor the forces of justice and freedom. In particular, there are positive trends at the United Nations and within the U.S. government. Let me briefly talk about each one. First, the UN. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has accepted petitions from the residents of Camp Ashraf that have requested the granting of refugee status. And the UN High Commission is moving forward to considering these requests. In the meantime, Camp Ashraf residents are now officially asylum seekers under international law, which provides them with another layer of protection against violence by the Iranian government or the Iraqi regime. All of this is progress. And this story takes place within a larger recent trend where the international community has not stood by helplessly and simply watched innocent civilians in Libya being slaughtered. I believe, and I know you'll agree, that the international community has a responsibility to protect the innocent residents of Camp Ashraf. It is simply not possible to stand by and do nothing. If never again applies to the residents of Benghazi, then it applies to the residents of Camp Ashraf. The international community cannot claim they do not know the perils these residents face every day, not after the events of April 8th earlier this year. Now, 6 months ago, these commitments by the UN and the larger international community did not exist. They do today. The UN High Commissioner and the UN Secretary General have publicly acknowledged the plight of the residents of Camp Ashraf, and we hope this will lead to even greater involvement by the UN. A second trend is taking place within the US government. Your message, our message, is increasingly reaching officials at the highest levels of the US government. In the past few days, Secretary of State Clinton has acknowledged publicly that she needs to decide the fate of the residents at Camp Ashraf. So some trends are positive. They're going in the right direction, but challenges remain. What do we do next? First, we need to continue explaining to the UN and the US government why it is so very important for them to help resolve these issues. Camp Ashraf needs international protection, and they need it immediately. There needs to be international monitors, preferably UN monitors, placed at the camp to safeguard the residents. Second, the administration needs to be encouraged to take a more aggressive role in pushing back against Iran. We've all read about the recent Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador and a Washington, D.C. resident, not very far from where we are today. If it had been successful, dozens of American citizens would have been killed and wounded in this attack. And yet, The administration reacted as if this plot was only a minor diplomatic misunderstanding. They have cited diplomatic protocols, invoked international norms, and characterized Tehran's plot as a violation of international law. No doubt it was that. But let's call it for what it really was, a direct attack against the United States. In other words, it was an act of war. One way to send a strong message to the Iranians that they cannot intimidate the U.S. is to immediately delist the MEK. This would be smart policy against a ruthless Iranian regime. It would be consistent with our international responsibility to protect. It would honor the promises we've made to safeguard the residents, and it is the right thing to do. I urge Secretary of State Clinton to take this step immediately. Thank you very much. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. General William S. Wallace. General Wallace assumed command of the 5 Corps on July 18, 2001. He commanded the Corps during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, before leaving to become the commanding general of the Army's Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The general assumed command most recently of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command at Fort Monroe, Virginia, in October of 2005. Please join me in welcoming General Wallace.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks also for the opportunity to join this distinguished panel today. At the outset of my remarks, I'd like to offer some comments about the Arab Spring itself, followed by comments on how those still unfolding events might impact Iran and U.S. policy, and then finally the issue of Camp Ashraf. Among those things to understand is the context of what has been called the Arab Spring. First, in no case has the change, either positive or negative, successful or not, promised by the events of earlier this year, run its full course. There are still lines being drawn, constitutions being written, and political parties being formed, strategies being developed, all of which will continue to influence outcomes for many months and most probably years. Second, it seems important not to use too broad a brush when analyzing the events of earlier this year. By that I mean that although some in the media and some political figures will look to similarities across events and then generalize as if those similarities form a regional or perhaps global pattern, it seems to me equally important to understand that each nation touched by the Arab Spring had unique circumstances which made change or the attempt at change possible, and those circumstances should not be overlooked nor overgeneralized. Now, having cautioned about overgeneralization, let me do exactly that. I'm certain that each of you looked at the events of the Arab Spring through a different lens and formed some notion of what, why, and how. I've done the same. The aspects of those events which seem to me to have the most universal impact are threefold. First, technology; second, response; and finally, political formation. First, technology. It goes without saying that the use of social media has become a potentially powerful political tool. From a call to assembly in Egypt to perhaps a rallying cry for Occupy Wall Street, the power of the internet and such applications of Twitter and YouTube and Facebook have proven that free and open dialogue resides on the internet in abundance, even where it might not reside in a society. Next, response and responders. As one looks to the events of the past year, there seems to be a relationship between responders and response, between change and status quo. In those locales where the established government, regardless of its complexion, could command the loyalty of responders, be they military, paramilitary, or police, or all three, then that government was likely to use those responders rapidly and decisively to put down whatever social unrest it might have faced. Finally, political formation. It's here where change seems to be slow. sometimes to the frustration of those who have brought about the change itself. From old government to interim government to new constitution to new elections, et cetera, what appears to be rapid transition from the old order to a new one tends to be painfully slow in progressing toward a final outcome. It is in the area of organization where I see potential danger. Let me elaborate. My thesis is simple. In places like the Middle East, political entities who have been in opposition to long-sitting government have normally been suppressed, sometimes outlawed. Those entities go underground and organize to survive, and it is this very organization that puts them in a favorable position as they come to the surface and as change takes place. This brings me to the subject of Iran, and more specifically, what messages might have been received in Tehran relative to the Arab Spring. My observations are the result of almost pure conjecture, since each of you is very aware that our ability to see and understand the decision-making process in Iran is opaque at best. And this process is influenced by internal dynamics that are not fully understood. What is clear, however, is the Islamic Revolution in Iran has failed to deliver on its promises of prominence and prosperity. It's also clear that Iran is in the midst of political transition, which is likely to manifest itself as Iran approaches the next round of national elections. What then might the messages that were received in Tehran be this spring? The first seems obvious, that being the power of social media and the internet. The control of internet service providers is already in place. The government of Iran also enjoys the control of both response and responder. The Islamic Republic seems to have created for itself a permanent state of emergency or crisis. Iran's civilian leadership has regularly used the IRGC and other agents to suppress domestic opposition, yet civilian institutions, which in many other states restrain the power of the military, are too weak to do so in Iran. The result has been a steady increase in the power of the IRGC, and the IRGC seems ready to impose a very high price upon society in order to achieve its goals, goals which are frequently not in sync with those of the Iranian people. And while the IRGC has increased in power, the Western governments tend to negotiate, if they choose to do so at all, with civilian politicians who are incapable of delivering. The net result is a bolder and a more assertive Iran, challenging U.S. and regional interests in an effort to gain recognition as the dominant power in the region and simultaneously seeking to exclude the influence of foreign powers. Recent U.S. policy response to the threat of Iran has been consistently inconsistent. The Iranians will continue to test the U.S. and allied red lines, and the U.S. will continue to try to contain and deter. And the only thing that might change that dangerously balanced equation is the Arab Spring of 2012. What then about Camp Ashraf? In 2003, as the 5th Corps commander in Iraq, I had the responsibility for security of the northern portion of the country. At the time, we saw no evidence that the MEK should be listed as a terrorist organization. Therefore, we negotiated their disarmament and provided for their protection, not as terrorists, but as a military organization. My expectation at the time was that delisting would occur and the occupants of Camp Ashraf would gain the refugee status that they deserve. Over 8 years, nothing has changed except the urgency of the issue. Delisting is the right thing to do and needs to occur immediately, without which no progress can be made, nor any pending humanitarian disaster averted. Thank you very much.